Okay, so I love this closet analogy because it's kind of like what it is like to analyze to do a descriptive analysis of quantitative data. And we're just going to talk about the very beginning stages of that today. It's like taking your very messy set of data and organizing it in a very nice, beautiful closet organizing kind of way. This is also a very good slide for you to upload a brief comment, either video or audio or written, about how things are going for you. I know you're probably not analyzing too much yet. You may just be getting your data ready, or maybe you're going through some of your qualitative data. But if you have any questions, or just to give me a brief update of how things are going, or to get feedback from your peers, this is a good spot to post. So on the agenda for this brief presentation, number one, I just want to revisit the purpose of why overall we're doing data analysis and touching base on that big picture stuff. Second, we'll talk about determining and recording your constructs, which is a really important step for survey data. Third, we'll talk about how to download and prepare your data for analysis, including organizing and cleaning your data. And finally, we'll talk about coding open-ended questions because most of you have open-ended questions. It's a very important part of data analysis. So once you've collected your survey data, the first step in analysis is to list the different things that you're asking your survey. So on the graphic organizer for descriptive analysis, you want to first list the demographic and descriptive information you're collecting, along with a definition of what exactly that is. So that includes things like years on the job, ethnicity, who they work with, what their degree is, where they went to school, all those kinds of things. The next thing on the list will be the constructs that you're asking about in the survey. And usually there are between 3 and 8 main constructs. And I'm going to give you some examples in the next slides. These constructs are not necessarily individual items. Sometimes, and actually quite often, there are several items that are together in one construct. This is especially true if there are multiple choice or Likert scale items. So Daryl has quite a number of items that are together one construct. And in his case, he's actually going to be averaging them. We'll get to that later. In other cases, you don't necessarily average them, but they're still part of one idea, one main idea. Every now and then there is only one item that pertains to a construct. Often open-ended questions are like that. So Andrea has several questions that are only really one item per construct. And you essentially want to list the items that belong in that construct. So if numerical, you'll write down, and then if the item is asking for A, B, C, D, you want to actually write that down in your definition there. And after you've labeled the constructs, write a definition of what that construct is with reference to the literature. So that's the process of filling out the graphic organizer, and I'll show you an example in the next slide, and then I'll talk a little bit about yours. So this is the graphic organizer you will end up filling out that is related to the last slide. And what we're talking about this week is essentially this stuff. This part we're going to get into next week. So you can see here, construct or demographic aspect. Years teaching would be a demographic aspect. And most of you have several of these demographic or descriptive parts. So you see my item number 14, and then I identify exactly what it means, years that the person has taught, and then because I had numbers, number 1, when it downloads the survey data, is 1 to 3 years, number 2 equals 48 years, number 3 equals 9 to 15 years. And the reason why this is really important to all have in one place is because ultimately your survey data is going to have this label that says years taught, and then it'll be like 1, 3, 4, 3, and you don't remember what that 3 means. And so here you have it written down. 3 means 9 to 15 years. Then I reference the literature. The years a person has taught seems to make a difference in how teachers take up professional development. Now, it might be a lot to ask for something like that for all of your demographic data. So if you have a reference, great. If you don't worry about it. Next, I turn to actual constructs that have to do with my research. So science instructional practice, reasoning, right? This is several items, 15 to 18, that refer to opportunities for students engaged in scientific argumentation and explanation of phenomena. So these are 15, 16, 17, 18, 4 items that that have to do with this scientific reasoning and these opportunities in class, and it's a Likert scale where teachers rate it from not very often to very often. And then here, this is where I think putting a little bit from the literature is really important in terms of transferring it over to your paper. In the end, that teachers tend to do these practices less often in their classes. So this is something that either you may see them doing it quite often or not very often. You see another one, teacher prior beliefs. Here's the items and the description here. And a little bit of reference to the literature. So that's essentially how your graphic organizer will look. It's perfectly fine to do it in Excel if you would like. So I'm going to use some of your work as the examples. So this is Andrea's survey. Here's our background questions, and she labels these. What year are you here at East Bay, and what's your major? So these are demographic variables or demographic items, and so they would be listed as demographic with a definition of what is meant by that question. And here we see some constructs, right? So experience transition, and this is actually, I think, again, Andrea did a great job of, in some ways, listing these by construct. So I think that in some ways, this is one construct. Student positive and negative experiences in the university. And then we have some program specific, right? So this is a construct that has to do with students' experiences in particular programs. And this would need to be fleshed out a little bit as to what is meant by each of these. Like what are you trying to get at with each of these? What are you trying to understand? And how does that relate back to the literature? So these are the things we would flesh out in our graphic organizer. And you may not actually know those things right now. So part of doing this graphic organizer is forcing yourself to dig in and think about, well, why did I ask those questions? Because then as you analyze and get on to the next step, you can be very clear in writing up the results, like why you asked them, what you were trying to get at, what comes out of them, how it relates back to the literature. And of course, it then helps you later as you move into your dissertation, because it may end up that you actually revise some of these questions if the construct is not clear enough. Here's an example from Tacey's work. Again, here, this would be a demographics question. How many years have you served in education? And this is where you would definitely, in your definition, want to write down what one, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you'd want to write down what each of these really means so that when it downloads into some sort of numbers, you know what they mean. Same with this one, demographic question. So these later can be used to examine your data, your findings. So you can use these as a way to say, okay, if they're very experienced versus if they're not very experienced, how do they respond in terms of technology? This here, how often do you use email, is probably related to one of your constructs, right? Because this is kind of an outcome. It's not a demographic variable. It's, hey, okay, like, what is your proclivity for using technology? So that might be something to consider putting in one of the constructs. Continuing with this example, this is a really good example of 3 questions that would be in the same construct, but you wouldn't be averaging them together. There's not like a series of Likert scales that you would average. So in Daryl's case, several questions would be averaged. In this case, I would call these as part of the same construct in terms of how a counselor tailors their work to particular ethnicities. But each of these is a slightly different way of asking about it, right? And including some open-ended responses. All right, so now you have done your constructs. You've written up all of your constructs as best as you can think through them. You've written a definition. If you have a citation or a piece of literature that corresponds, you've added in a sentence or two about that, or you've put in a citation, and now you have this data set. So I'm going to talk a little bit about getting your data ready for analysis. Each of you has a very different kind of data set, and they're all in different places. So I'm going to try to talk to each of you in certain ways. All right. So first off, those of you who have SurveyMonkey, I think there's a couple of you, you'll want to download your data and essentially into an Excel spreadsheet. You go to SurveyMonkey, and then up in the right-hand corner, it says Analyze Results. You'll want to export all, and then select all response data, and then Excel, and then numerical. So if you're having trouble with that, just let me know and I can talk you through it, or I'm sure we can find a YouTube video that will help you. Essentially, for those of you who have it another way, so for example, in Google Forms, Tacey, I am not sure how it works. I've never used a Google form, but you'll have to find out how to essentially download your data into Excel. And the goal is this. You want your people on the rows. So you can see here, these are my respondents. These are actually my participants who will always be on the rows. You want your items on the columns. So these are your actual questions are going to go across in columns. Your people are going to be the rows. That's really, really important to set it up that way. So once you've downloaded the data, or maybe sometimes you're just copying and pasting it into an Excel spreadsheet. So I think in the case of Andrea, you may actually have it in such a way, well, if you're doing SurveyMonkey, it'll probably download this way. But in any case, you might have different processes, and please just let me know if you're struggling to get it into an Excel spreadsheet in this way. And I also recommend YouTube videos are a good place to go. So you notice here that, first of all, across my columns, I often have kind of a shorthand description, like this is free and reduced lunch. You can see this is a particular barrier, math, language arts. This is a particular barrier, accountability, so that I can read the title, or I can get a sense of what that item is just from looking at a very brief title rather than a really long title. I always make sure that there's a date somewhere in there. And then also notice that I have an ID for both the person responding and for the school number, so that I am keeping my data confidential. It's not as important right now for your study, your pilot study, but certainly it's important for your dissertation. And then you can see here, I've got my demographic stuff, right? So this is school demographics, free and reduced lunch, their test scores, and then I've got my teacher demographics, the years they've been a teacher, and notice here that I'm also using Likert scales. So the number 4 doesn't actually mean 4 years as a teacher, it means something like 12 to 15 years. And then here I start in on my constructs. This is the minutes that they teach Science Education Week. So it's called minutes total, and you can see how it varies across this column. All right. And I've defined that, of course, in my graphic organizer. And then I had a series of Likert questions about barriers. Okay, so barriers, here's my 3 barriers, or 4 barriers, and these actually formed one construct. So I ended up averaging them. And I think for most of you that won't happen except for Daryl. And finally, I had this open-ended question about what excellent science looks like. So I have all of their open-ended responses here. So this is essentially how you'll want to set up your data table for future analysis. All right, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail for folks that have numerical data. So if you don't have numerical data, I guess particularly Andrea, no, you probably don't. You may not need to pay attention to this slide. But essentially, getting your data ready, so once you have it in your Excel spreadsheet, delete any respondents who did not answer the questions. I only delete respondents who didn't answer any of the questions. Occasionally there's folks who didn't answer a few questions here or there. That's fine. You should definitely leave them. Only delete ones who didn't answer any of them. You will sometimes also find numbers that are too high, too low, a little bit strange. So for example, one thing that often happens, and I noticed this is one of Tacey's questions, is that I ask for a percent of time that they spend doing something, and they write in something that's more than 100%. So I have to either figure out what they meant or delete it, right? Because I don't want a number in there that's more than is possible. Um, and then in Daryl's case, but possibly in some of you others, you might have constructs with several items that you need to average, that you need to create a new column in Excel and average the numbers across the columns to create essentially a construct number. Um, Others of you may have numerical data like a percentage, um, but it doesn't need to be averaged, but it may not be in numerical form. So that's something that's really important if you want to analyze things, you know, in terms of descriptive statistics, for example, is that you make sure that it's in numerical form. Okay, so that's just a few things for cleaning up and getting your numerical data ready. Um, Daryl, I am sure that if you don't know how to make an average on an Excel spreadsheet, I'm sure there's a YouTube video that demonstrates it, but I will go ahead and look it up, or you can email me and let me know and I'll help you out. Next week, the video will demonstrate how to take this numerical data and turn it into descriptive statistics and charts. It will be very fun. Many of you also have open-ended questions. I know Andrea's, most of her surveys open-ended. I saw some on Tacey's. So analyzing open-ended questions is kind of like qualitative coding. It's a little bit different. For each question, you want to list each major response that emerged from your coding. So in my example here, the question was, what helped with your reasoning regarding a scientific process? And then I start listing all the things that the students bring up. So, and this is just two of the things they brought up out of maybe 10. Revising the lab, talking to peers, and then there was a number of things. So I generally say, okay, well, they may not all use the words revising the lab, but they'll say something like, yeah, when I had to go back and like change some of the things in the lab report, that made me really get what was important. Or they might actually use the words revising the lab, or they might refer to having to turn something in twice. In any case, each time I'm like, yeah, that's still about revising the lab. Okay. And then I will tally each time that I think someone's talking about revising the lab as helping them with their reasoning. And then, you know, they might have talked about, oh yeah, it was really great when I could talk to my lab partner, Tacey, about how to do this lab, or, you know, what that really helped me to think about such and such, right? So then I'll code it here or put a tally. So essentially you want to, it's a matter of categorization, just like qualitative coding. You get the main ideas that are emerging, you put them all in a row, and then you tally how many people have said those things. And then I find it very, very helpful to then put some of the most key quotes that had to do with that onto the table. So it gives me a sense of what people actually said, plus then I can take directly from this table into my findings. Just like qualitative coding, this often ends up with some splitting and merging of codes. In many cases, I have codes or these kinds of themes or areas that emerge from the data. And after coding, I realize that there's two of them that are very similar. And so I'll put them together. Or maybe there's two that only have one respondent each and they're pretty similar. So I'll put them together. So you end up reorganizing it as you move through the process. That's just a quick and dirty how to analyze open-ended questions. If you have any questions, please post here.